Gentlemen, welcome to the program. You both have pretty divergent views and on the record as such regarding the best route forward for security for Ukraine. First and foremost, I just want to ask you to put it into the context of what happened. Does what happened over the weekend, the challenge to Putin, change any equation? Anders Fogh Rasmussen.
Yes, indeed. What we saw in the weekend was how fragile the Russian society is and the instability that Russia really represents. That strengthens the argument for letting Ukraine join NATO. We need Ukraine as a strong and stable Eastern European ally that can serve as a bulwark against a still aggressive Russia.
And Stephen, you don't think Ukraine should be in NATO now or in a first instance. But do you think things have been changed since the events of the weekend and how it showed Putin, is potentially vulnerable?
Thank you. Good to be with both of you. I just don't think what happened over the weekend changes the equation at all with respect to Ukraine's membership prospects in NATO. The simple fact is that if Ukraine were to join NATO, first of all, it would cross a well-established red line for Russia that many have warned about over the years. And thus, if this current war ends, it could prompt a Russian reinvasion of Ukraine. And secondly, it would confront the entire NATO alliance with two unpalatable options. First, to wage what President Biden has called World War III with Russia over Ukraine. Or second, to decline to defend Ukraine and thereby weaken NATO's Article 5 security guarantee across the entire alliance. So I think that's the inescapable reality of trying to bring Ukraine into NATO.
Well, before I get former Secretary General to comment on that, I do need to ask you, because that is the argument that has prevailed since the beginning of this, precisely as you lay it out. And I'm actually just trying to wonder whether events over more than a year of war may have outdated those. I mean, for instance, Stephen, you say Ukraine's best path to peace is to be well armed and supported outside NATO. But this fear of Putin doing other than the invasion, these so-called escalations, have actually not come to pass.
Well, I think that, the increasing cooperation between NATO and Ukraine was one factor, among others, that probably precipitated Putin's terrible decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, it's true that in the course of the war, some fears that Russia would escalate have proved to be unfounded. On the other hand, Ukraine and its partners have tried to act with a sense of restraint because the overall goal, at least by the United States and the NATO alliance, has been to avoid a direct clash between NATO forces and Russian forces. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very hard in the midst of this terrible invasion, completely unjustified invasion of Ukraine, to be concerned about provoking Russia. Of course, that's not where people are thinking today. But at some point, thank goodness, this war will somehow come to an end. And at that point, it will become very important to find the most stable path for Ukraine and for Europe.
Anders Fogh Rasmussen, I want to ask you a similar question about the fears of Putin. Because from the very beginning, as Stephen said, President Biden said, I'm not going to start World War III over Ukraine. Even before that, President Obama would say, the similar things, everybody concerned about starting a nuclear war and the like. Did we get it wrong about Putin? Do you think that's a legitimate fear? And have we actually played into that narrative?
Yes, we got it wrong. The fact is that Putin will not use nuclear weapons because that would be the end of his regime in Russia. And we should never, ever give in to threats from Russia. The problem is that we promised Ukraine back in 2008 that Ukraine will become a member of NATO, but we didn't do anything. So for 15 years, they have been in the waiting room, and the waiting room is not a safe place. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what Finland and Sweden have realized. and that's what we should recognize for Ukraine as well. So I think we should extend an invitation to Ukraine sooner rather than later.
So, Stephen Wertheim, you don't think they should be in NATO now. You're nodding about the waiting room, which everybody says was the worst of all the possible solutions, having been invited and then nothing happened for all those years. What do you think then now is the best way to offer Ukraine, security guarantees if and when this war ends?
Well, I'd like to see pretty bold action starting at the Vilnius summit to show Ukraine a viable path forward, not only after the war, but also during this war. So I think it's an idea many have discussed, including the Ukrainian government, based on the model of Israel, in which Ukraine's partners would essentially formalize the kind of very effective security cooperation that they've extended during this conflict, make sure that Ukraine has multi-year agreements and that there's international coordination rather than the ad hoc kind of support that had to be improvised in the wake of Russia's invasion last year. I think that's a viable way forward, thanks to the bravery that Ukrainian forces have shown in their effectiveness on the battlefield.
But Israel has nuclear weapons. They're not declared, but everybody knows they have them. Ukraine gave them up precisely with a guarantee from the West and Russia to protect its territorial integrity. It doesn't have those weapons right now. They didn't, Russia didn't protect its territorial integrity. So how would that help?
Sure, not every aspect of Israel needs to be copied by Ukraine. I will say in 1994, when Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons that were stationed on its territory, it received assurances, not guarantees, to go to war on behalf of Ukraine. Those assurances obviously are not strong enough, and Russia's word cannot be trusted. But what I see us hurtling toward in the upcoming summit in Vilnius is something like Bucharest Redux, a copy of 2008, where we have some NATO members that are pushing to admit Ukraine, not the United States this time, as it was in 2008, and others that really don't want to do that. And so what I fear is that I completely agree, a waiting room does not make sense for Ukraine or for anyone. But I fear that that's where we'll end up unless there's some real willpower to say, actually, this is not the right time for Ukraine to join NATO, and it's very hard to see what that right time could possibly be. But there is another path that can be very effective that will take a lot of money, resources, and commitment from Ukraine's international partners. But that's where we should all really focus our energy.
I mean, I guess the question there is that effective and efficient? Anders Fogh Rasmussen, effective and efficient, and if they don't get the invitation, which I think nobody expects them to get at this Vilnius summit, what is yet another waiting room? I mean, yet another interim solution. You're on record as saying, I've spoken with several Eastern European leaders, and there is a group of hardcore Eastern Central European allies that want at least a clear path for Ukraine towards NATO membership. But you've also said that they might actually step in and provide soldiers and presence.
Yeah, I have warned against that kind of split. What I would like to stress is the ultimate security guarantee for Ukraine would be to join NATO and be covered by Article 5. It may be, as you indicated, that they will not get an invitation in Vilnius. So I would suggest the following way forward. Firstly, a number of NATO allies sign up to provide security guarantees for Ukraine because they will need them anyway. Until Ukraine can join NATO, they will need security guarantees to make them more capable to defend themselves against any future Russian attack. That's exactly the content of the Kiev Security Compact that I handed over to President Zelensky last year. That should be one thing. And then at the Vilnius summit, we should offer Ukraine the same accelerated path towards NATO membership as Finland and Sweden have received, and we should establish a NATO Ukraine Council with a mandate to determine the conditions that must be met for Ukraine to join NATO. And the timeline of that, the deadline should be the next NATO summit that will take place next year in Washington, D.C.
It's really interesting. Again, I want to put forward what President Zelensky said to me when I interviewed him a few months ago, that they're fed up of, of the fear that the outside world has because they know Putin and the Russians better than anybody else. This is what he said to me.
I think that Russia feeds on these fears. And I think this is a big mistake of the last few decades. Russia feels it has this power. The more you give it, the more it feels your fear. It lives by it.
So to both of you then, that's the view from the inside. And I know you know this because you advise them, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. I mean, the big fear from everybody is if it becomes a member of NATO, then Article 5 means that you all have to protect it, or not, or NATO's, the heart of NATO disintegrates. So what would be so bad about actually committing to protect Ukraine within a NATO format as you're doing outside a NATO format? And what would be better than that?
I think the problem with the NATO format is simply that there is a very real risk that even if this war ends, there would be a recurrence, and therefore the commitment that NATO members would make to defend Ukraine or a portion of Ukraine is quite would be a very real prospect of coming due. And then we would be in a situation that we can see no one actually wants in the NATO countries to directly fight Russia over Ukraine, even now. And so this commitment, rather than, I think, providing the very strong security guarantee that Ukrainians would like, would actually, in the specific case of Ukraine, lack sufficient credibility from Moscow's perspective. Moscow would look and see that since 2014, when Russia in fact invaded Ukraine, every NATO member declined to fight Russia over Ukraine. And so it would actually have the opportunity, if Ukraine were to join, to fracture the NATO alliance and weaken Article 5 across the entire alliance if it tried to test that commitment in the weakest point. So it's just a bridge too far. I think I completely agree on the framework of the Kyiv Security Compact to create a Ukraine that truly is able to defend itself and do so credibly over the long term.
So, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, I want to read you what Henry Kissinger has said on the occasion of his 100th birthday. Mr. Realpolitik, who did not think, he thought very much like Stephen, that Ukraine should not be part of NATO. He says he's changed his mind now. We have now armed Ukraine to a point where it will be the best armed country and with the least strategically experienced leadership in Europe. So for the safety of Europe, it is better to have Ukraine in NATO. So your comment on that, but also the flip side of what Stephen said, the fear is of provoking Russia and having another war, and all of this is not over yet. But we've seen Russia's incompetence over the last year, its inability to convert this to a rapid victory. And so I guess my question is, having seen Russia's capability, does that give Ukraine more kudos for actually joining?
I spoke with Henry Kissinger some days ago, and I fully agree with his argument for letting Ukraine join NATO. The only thing Putin respects is NATO's Article 5, and that's the reason why he hasn't attacked any NATO country yet. He respects that, and that's why Ukraine should join NATO. We have to ensure a more peaceful and stable European continent. And to that end, we need Ukraine as a NATO member. We need that because that would free up resources and give the US and others more room maneuver to address the real long-term geopolitical challenge, namely China and the Indo-Pacific. That's why we need a new European security architecture with Ukraine, Finland, and Sweden as members of NATO.
Stephen Wertheim, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.